And it's starting. Brilliant. All right. So without further ado, I'll hand over to my colleague, Dr. Rob Gallagher from Manchester Metropolitan University from our English department to introduce Tabitha Nikolai, who's our speaker today. Thanks very much, Rob.
Thanks, Chloe. And thanks to everyone for turning up. It's really nice to see some familiar names in the list. And yeah, welcome to the Manchester Metropolitan Games Centre, albeit virtually. My name's Rob, I'm a lecturer here, and I'm extremely excited to welcome our guest today, Tabitha Nikolai. So Tabitha is an artist and game designer based in Portland, Oregon, where she teaches and manages galleries for the Portland State University School of Art and Design. Their work has been shown at the Portland Institute for Contemporary Art, the Utah Museum of Contemporary Art, Vox Populi Philadelphia, and Ganka Gallery Tokyo, among others, and has also been featured in publications such as ID Magazine, the New York Times, and Art in America. And I think I first came across Tabitha's work a few years ago, when I was exploring how DIY and avant-garde video game designers were addressing the impact of the internet on how we interact, how we form communities, and how we forge identities. And Tabitha's work certainly meets that brief, but I think it also does a whole host of other things. It's really playful and thoughtful about gaming culture and the paradoxes of gamer identity. It explores the resonances of queer and trans history in the present. It documents what can feel a lot like the slow, agonizing collapse of a certain form of liberalism and the rise of right-wing movements. But I think it's also concerned with the utopian possibilities that the current moment might still hold. So I've asked Tabitha to give a brief introduction to their practice, after which we're going to talk for maybe a little bit less than an hour. And then, as Chloe said, there'll be time for questions. So do please feel free to submit questions in the chat at any time, and we'll try and keep an eye on them and pick out some to address in the Q&A. So welcome, Tabitha, and if you're happy to give an overview of your work, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thanks everybody for having me. Rob blurbed a little bit about my work. You know, I come at this from a visual art background for the better part of what I do. Usually that's stuff like installation, sometimes performance, sometimes sculpture, but that always intersects some form of new media to comment on digital subcultures, digital culture, the bleed back and forth between like stuff that happens online and how that comes into manifestations in the physical world. And lately there's, you know, I've had a prolonged investigation using video game technologies because that's stuff that I grew up playing. And knowing also that that's like, you know, that's some of your interest here. I can give a little bit of a blurb about maybe how I got into doing games from a more straightforward visual art background. So right now I'm screen sharing, hoping that you're able to see a picture on the screen of like a sort of a dragon. Is that right, Rob? Do you see what I see? Awesome. Okay. I'm always like with screen sharing, like shit, I don't know what's come through. So, you know, my background was originally in painting and drawing, and I grew up in Salt Lake City, Utah, and the program that I was in was like a really conservative, you know, you got to paint the fruit, you got to paint the naked people, you got to paint the faceted teapot, and all of the things, or I guess it's a coffee percolator, but for those of you who have done that stuff, you know what I'm talking about. And I guess it's an antidote to that kind of the conservatism of the place, the smallness of the place. Like my drawing just had to kind of take on bigger and bigger qualities and become more immersive. So immersiveness is a thread that I guess comes throughout my work and comes into video games as an immersive media. So some of the earlier work that I was doing, like this image, is illustrating these kind of personal mythologies, these fantasy worlds that were helping me kind of process stuff. So, you know, here there's this sort of like dragon figure. I don't know if you can really see it depending on the resolution, but carrying this child, this sort of like inner child, and trying to handle that. And I guess I grew up playing like tons of Dungeons and Dragons and Vampire the Masquerade and Mage the Ascension and stuff like that. So, you know, those kind of game spaces were always like a respite for me growing up in Utah, and a space to certainly experiment with identity, you know, as like a safe spot among, you know, being a person who is like socialized male, grew up as a dude. That was a space to like be able to kind of safely do that among a bunch of other mostly dudes. And so that's always made an impression on me about like the power that games have to like imagine for yourselves or imagine for your worlds. So I changed the slide now. Did it keep track of that? Or did it hold on the last slide? Okay, that's another one I feel like we get hung up on sometimes. So then like I went, as I progressed in the work that I was doing through grad school, like I stopped kind of illustrating mythologies and brought into my practice like you know, for a long time, I've had like a real like earnest personal magical practice. And so rather than creating this kind of like figment world, this sort of like imagined world, I turned to just like doing the magic as the thing itself. And I think certainly there's like crossover with games insofar as like, you know, magic as a rule set by which, you know, desire can be actualized or, you know, other worlds can be communed with. So I think there's a crossover that way. So, you know, in this kind of stuff that I'm doing here, it's like I'm doing these magical rituals for a certain end, and then there's like a remnant left over that an audience can explore as an installation. So on the ground, there's like a sigil for like a Gothic demon with these various like offerings placed upon the sigil in different places, but also obviously sort of feels like a hopscotch, or it feels, you know, diagrammatic in that way. And then in the room, there's like almost like a proto gaming station that would appear in like later work of mine, where you have this divination station where like, you know, there's this light box with like a chip of mica that has the same sigil for that demon etched on it. So this sort of mock experience where it's like broadcasting your attention to the light box of the demon off into like the other world where the demon resides. And the divination comes through playing this game that was a game that I played as a kid called Labyrinth, that I don't know if y'all have that too, but you know, you slide these things around. It's a really simple game, and the Labyrinth remakes itself. So I guess thinking about a labyrinth as walking a labyrinth as a form of divination, right? It's a thing, or seeking inspiration, that kind of stuff. And so then I guess I started to really include like video gamey things in my work, just in sense of like thinking of economy in this instance. So like, you know, this is a piece of performance art where I'm eating this frosting for 3 hours as a way of like trying to take that sweetness to like give me this sweet ideal girlhood where I have this like sweet Lolita cosplay that I do, and projected over that as like a living instance of a Minecraft landscape. So this kind of like Eden existing within this Eden as a space of remaking oneself, but like partly wanting to use the livingness of a Minecraft instance to counter like what do I say? Like, I feel like a lot of times galleries can feel like mausoleums for ideas. And so whenever I do an installation or a performance or something, I want the space to feel alive, because I think it sort of heightens senses, heightens even like the agency of the audience in the experience. What next? And then, so after I was out of school and I didn't have the overhead to be doing installations or necessarily ready access to space to be installing artwork, I turned to video games more in earnest, initially doing like these kind of hacks and mods of Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, a game that was built in the Half-Life engine. And so, you know, getting into the files of that and using mods of that to make or elaborate on spaces in the game. So this was a disused scene from that game that's a rough replica of a place called the Bradbury Building, which is, I think it's in LA, or it could be San Francisco, I apologize, that was used in the movie Blade Runner. And so I was doing this piece that was sort of about Blade Runner and analogizing being a replicant and being trans. And so, you know, I made the space look more like it was in Blade Runner, so that you would kind of like explore it and abide with that. And so that's what I was doing before. The next stuff where I started using the Unity game engine and making things a little bit more from scratch, though I think we'll get into conversations about that. And then always like staging the video games alongside, again, either like physical installation stuff or in this case, these kind of costumes or statues that elucidate a bit more about the world. So this is a set of games being paired, or excuse me, a set of costumes being paired with the game Sic Trans Sex Gloria, which is this kind of like sci-fi fantasy world game about a group of people called Soyborgs, which are this like trans feminist, like separatist sect, this like militant sect. And in the story of the game, the kind of death and transmigration of the soul of one of the field operatives of the Soyborgs who is killed in an operation. And then these are sort of example Soyborgs that might go with it. So kind of elucidates the world, but you can see the PlayStation there in the back and then a close-up of that. So also trying to do things like, you know, making custom controllers with like glitter and stuff and making this like computer mouse look like a soybean because it's all very soy themed. You know, the mat here is like printed with soy plants, the same ones that exist in the game. And there's like ocean of soy milk around this tower that you climb to like get part of the narrative. What else do I have here? And then this is just, I think this is the last slide that I have, is an example of another installation of stuff where it's like trying to really make the installation cohesive. So here, you know, you play a game on screen here using this, hoping you can see my cursor. If not, on the left, there's like a sort of a crystal ball that acts as a trackball for rotating this like planetoid, this asteroid. And then you go through different sort of eras, geological eras of this asteroid, but it's all being run on this computer over here, which I do have a slide of actually, which is like a PC built into like a vat of mineral oil, which was like a thing in PC gaming for a while, because ostensibly at least it cools things more efficiently because the mineral oil that's non-conductive pulls the heat out of all the parts simultaneously, and then you pump it out into a radiator. But then, you know, playing with like visual signifiers of like almost like the diorama space of like the aquarium, and then thinking about it hosting a world within that. So you have these like layers of inception going inward into that world. So that's like a really brief overview of my practice and the stuff that I do. And I'm sure we'll get into more stuff as we go. Totally. Yeah. You're muted. Yeah.
That's really fascinating and kind of leads into the first thing I wanted to ask about, which is that I've only really had the chance to experience your work via the documentation that's out there online, your site, the videos that are out there, but also some of those kind of virtual experiences and games that you've made available for download. At the same time, it's really clear that the kind of layout of physical spaces, the creation of kind of objects, and also this dimension of, I don't know whether you prefer to call it performance or ritual, are really important. And in fact, let me see if I can share my screen, because I had a few images of some of the pieces to discuss while I try and allow Zoom to do that. I'll try and bring this up, but essentially I was curious about how you think of the fact that people might be experiencing this work out of context in a way, that some of these pieces can circulate as games online rather than being encountered in situ, or rather than being seen as part of an installation or a performance, and whether you think of that as kind of diminishing their impact, or as kind of giving them a different kind of context.
Yeah, I think it's a different context. You know, certainly I come to like doing art and thinking about people, you know, going to galleries and experiencing that like physical first. That's sort of like, I guess that's sort of like my training, if not like how I come at it first. You know, just from like a background in playing games. Like I came to be doing games for a couple of reasons. Like one, just like the material expedience of like, you know, the stuff that I was doing right before making games was these like horrendous like physical vaporwave installations of office furniture and stuff, and it was just a nightmare to be doing. So it's just expedient in that way, but like with it as a form that was honest to my experience, you know, growing up playing them, it's also like they can be vectored outward and they can reach audiences that I really care about that are never going to go to galleries and museums, for whom those like experiences may not be really accessible. You know, growing up in Salt Lake, there's just like there weren't a lot of art things, and certainly like art things in this like weird space. So it's a way to communicate with people and have that like, I don't know, I think there's a really wonderful intimacy in a way that it's like the game can go and it's like I can be sitting side by side with you at home, having a conversation through the media in a way that like can be, you don't have in the same way in the gallery. It's like video games function in a really strange way in the gallery, in that it's like maybe you feel conspicuous, like you're being watched if like people are around while you're playing it, or like you don't want to devote the time. Like a lot of art audiences are more about like slow retinal experiences and not like experiences with active agency where you're touching and participating in a thing, or people just have aversion to screens. So, you know, they function differently in different ways. I guess I don't necessarily privilege either. Yeah, and I mean, I think the ritual or the performance components are also important. Like, you know, I did one piece called Adaton Nail Salon that was like one of those early pieces using Half-Life game stuff, where I was just again using it as like a different background, and people could like mouse around and look around the room that I'd created, almost as though it was a set for us to be doing that stuff in, while I would like do water marbling on their fingernails, you know, like fancy end papers of books, that kind of marbling, but on their fingernails, and then telling their fortunes through the designs that I had that were like on the nails. I had like a system of like, I don't know, it's like reading tea leaves or something, right? But like in their fingernails. So like always trying to play with different ways of intimacy, gaining intimacy, and rupturing like what can a lot of times just be really cold. New media art, like digital art, can often feel cold. So I was trying to figure out ways to like rupture that a bit.
That's really interesting. And I think, I mean, in some ways it feels really appropriate that these would be artifacts that are out there circulating for people to kind of encounter in their own spaces and in their own time. And yeah, I wonder, I'm not actually able to get my slides up, but maybe what I will do is post some links in the chat to your site where there's really nice documentation of a lot of this work. And yeah, that piece that Adaton Nail Salons.
Rob, sorry, do you want me to see if I can, do you want to send them to me and see if I can get them up for you?
Sure, that would be great, Chloe. I'll email you.
Thank you.
Cool.
And I will also say, yeah, the second question I wanted to ask, maybe this should have been the first question. I'm using the term games here, and you're talking at our games center. But I don't know whether you think of some of these kind of immersive works or these 3D environments as games necessarily. So I'm kind of interested in that question, but also how they might kind of speak to more recognizable or more traditional games and genres, with pieces like Shrine Maidens of the Unseelie Court, for example. I think it's in dialogue in a really interesting way with some of the sorts of walking simulators that you see that have gained a certain degree of popularity over the last decade. Games like Gone Home or What Becomes of Edith Finch, where you're kind of exploring these kind of suburban nuclear households. And Shrine Maidens, for example, does something similar to that, but then goes somewhere very different with it. But how would you sort of position your work in relation to other games? Do you see them as games, or how do you think of them?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I mean, that's part of what I love about the medium, is it feels very living and it feels very like unsettled in what it is and what it wants to be. I say video games like when I'm talking about them, only because that's like the most expedient term for people to understand what I'm talking about. Like for a while I was like, well, so like, I mean, if you haven't played any of the things that I make, they're like terrible as video games. They're not interesting. Like because I'm not like a coder in background, obviously I've like picked up some of that as I've gone along. Like mechanically speaking, they're not satisfying, they're not fun. But you know, they're more visual, or you know, there's a lot of text in them, or not a lot, but there's text in them that establishes kind of the aesthetic satisfaction of the game. So I say video games because like people know what a video game is. For a while, I was like describing them as virtual environments. And the problem then became that everybody thought that I made only VR things. And I've only made one VR thing, and that was a bad experience trying to exhibit VR. And we could talk about what I think is the clunkiness of VR if we wanted to. But so it's like you can say like, oh, I'm making video games, and then take it from there in terms of like, oh, they're video games, but they're like, here are the ways that I at least try to subvert or don't adhere to characteristics of that medium. And that'll kind of give people an idea of what it is that I do. But, you know, it's like, I like it, you know, video game, the tools are great because it lets you do experiential abstraction kinds of things that aren't really possible in installation art. So that's one of the reasons that I would come at it. And I'm trying to hold on to like bits of your question as we go. How do I classify them in terms of like walking simulator and genre and stuff like that? You know, the walking simulator thing is interesting because like I'd never heard of walking simulators before I made those things. As somebody told me later. And I was like, oh wow, okay, there's this whole like genre of thing that I need to investigate. And so like, you know, it's like some of my own naivete about it, where I just picked up Unity, and coming at it from like an installation art background, like in the Unity standard assets, it comes with an FPS controller. That was something I grew up using and playing those kind of games. So it like just made sense to roll that in as like, oh, here's how you could explore it. And then discovering later that there's like a whole dialogue around that stuff.
That's really interesting. And it's fascinating to hear that in a way, games were just the most expedient and cheapest way to do things with kind of space and staging that were maybe not kind of logistically possible otherwise. And thanks, Chloe, for bringing the slides up. I guess this maybe gives some of a sense of how some of the digital works are kind of part of these broader installations or these performances. And maybe the second slide gives a little bit of a sense of some of the game world of Shrine Maidens, and this house where it initially seems like it's very kind of slice of life realism in some ways, but then there are these very video gamey touches like portals to psychic maelstroms and giant arachnids roaming around. And on that topic of space, I guess, and hearing that in a way, game engines are appealing because they let you craft these certain kinds of spaces. I wanted to ask about a couple of spaces that seem to kind of recur in your work. One of them is the gamer den, I suppose, the kind of bedroom or living space that is really kind of dominated by gaming technology. And there's a version of this in both Shrine Maidens and the game Ineffable Glossolalia, which I think are on the third slide, where you actually seem to use some of the same assets, some of the same 3D models to kind of sketch out this space where there's like a mattress, there's a gaming PC, and there's not much else. They're a little bit reminiscent of these spaces you see on like the male living space subreddit, where you might see a basement where there's like a folding chair and a huge CRT with the Demon Souls title screen on it. And you also incorporate into both of them a poster for Quake 3 that I think is a really interesting, disturbing way that they marketed that game back in the late 90s, where there's this kind of gaming den where the chair is a toilet and there's kind of festering microwave meals. And the idea is obviously that you kind of never leave this space. So in some ways, these spaces read as quite bleak, but you also use this kind of language of shrines and temples to describe them and kind of present them as refuges. So I'd be really interested to hear more about that kind of duality that's there.
Yeah, I love that you're hitting on that duality. Yeah, I mean, they're definitely like, there's spaces, you know, they mainly come out of like suburban bedrooms of like, you know, places I grew up around, friends I've had. And so, yeah, they're definitely like formative spaces of identity in that way, and that they are sort of like, you know, youthful and feral. So in that way, they're also like dens. Yeah, and it's like, I don't know, they're intimate spaces. So maybe also wanting to like bring that intimacy of the space and the medium of games together a bit. Yeah, what to say about them? Like, thinking about in Ineffable Glossolalia, it's like it comes in as like this like kind of crescendo midway through the game where, you know, in that game you're exploring this like sex research institute, and you know, you go through this weird like medical chamber, and then you come out into this bedroom. So it's a tell that like, okay, the space is definitely not what it seems. And like in that one, you know, there's like digital weird artifacted music by my friend Rainey Baker. And then there's like all these screens of images of dialogue from 4chan there. So it's like, you know, there's spaces that are like sparsely populated by physical stuff where the digital is primary. So it's like, you know, they're kind of low executive function depression spaces where, you know, maybe if you're somebody who doesn't care about their body or has a hard time connecting with their body, the way you actualize is by going into the digital. And so the digital takes up more space. Like in that one, especially, I think the light cast from the monitor is really strong. So you go into that space looking for sublimation, looking for transformation, looking for, I don't know, the virtual potential of becoming. And in Ineffable Glossolalia, it's pretty harsh, it's pretty difficult, because like the presence of the digital stuff that is there in the room in the form of the screen grabs from 4chan are predictably pretty awful, and all of that stuff was like taken from their LGBT board, and it's just extremely antagonistic to trans people in spite of being on an ostensibly queer board. And then in Shrine Maidens of the Unseelie Court, yeah, you are kind of in this wilderness and you're exploring the suburban house, like you're saying, Rob. And you know, you first, like with the slide that I'm seeing on screen here now, you eventually get your way to the bathroom where there's this, it seems like a pretty normal suburban house, and then you get to the bathroom and there's this like marijuana grow operation, and there's this bathtub that you climb into, and that serves as a portal. So again, it's like thinking about taking a bath and like going into yourself and self-reflecting, and you climb down that ladder deeper and deeper and deeper underwater, and then you come out onto this like plateau inside this cave, this grotto, where on the plateau within the grotto there's only this room, this like gamer den room in this box, whereas like behind it there's this like giant chrome like burning vulva in the air. And so it's like these like layers of going inward into yourself in the bath, into your room to sort of nestle you, but then it's like, again, in that inward space, you then can connect outward through the system of shrines to other people, which again is sort of bittersweet. And that piece was made partly in response to like a relationship I was in, and just to process feelings about queer community and like what's fraught about queer community and what's fraught about queer community, maybe particularly online, because there's a lot of perverse incentives, I think, in online community. So yeah, the difficulties of being in that sort of feral space where you feel disconnected from physical reality to go into the digital, but that's a troubling space as well.
Yeah, I think they work really powerfully as these kind of spatial metaphors, where I get to go back to kind of walking sim discourse. There's often an assumption that these are very mature works of digital art because they're grounded everyday spaces, but I think you find ways of kind of dramatizing how connection actually feels and what accessing these different sites and spaces through these terminals can feel like. I think another really interesting aspect maybe of Ineffable Glossolalia in particular is that you incorporate all of these images, some from kind of modernist art and collage, some from kind of gaming culture, and the space itself feels like it's kind of sutured together out of all of these bits and pieces. And I know, I mean, the theorists like Anna Paletti have talked about collage sometimes being a distinctively queer mode where you can adopt these figures from history or culture as your kind of avatars or your mouthpieces. And people like Lucas Crawford have also talked about specifically trans deployments of collage. Is that, do you find that kind of a useful framework to talk about something like Ineffable Glossolalia? how were you kind of working with some of those artworks that are kind of on the walls there?
In Ineffable Glossolalia, the things are sourced from a few different places. Some of the images that are on the wall in those like early, the early spaces in Ineffable Glossolalia are they're done off of research about what the Institute for Sexual Research was like in Berlin. So what archives kind of remain of that. So some of the images, though none in the picture, are like bits from their archives. They would have people doing art in the space and then holding on to it. So some of it is that, or like collections from there. One of the first things you see is this like these like perverse sailor puppets that are like hazing each other or something like that, and that was like part of their archive of weird sexy things that they had at the Sex Research Institute. And so that informs the general interior in the sense of like the art that's shown in the images in the space, like Max Beckmann's Departure triptych. It's like, these were all artists who were like deemed degenerate art in the Nazi degenerate art exhibition. So thinking about those forms of like degeneracy, obviously trans people are called degenerate all the time, and that obsession with like bodily integrity and degeneration of the body or perceived debasement of the body. And, all of the text that comes up in that room, the room with the Departure triptych, are words from Max Beckmann. So like all of that text is taken. The vast majority of the text in Ineffable Glossolalia is taken. Only a couple of the poetic interludes are like things that I wrote. And so, that the game in general is about like when you don't have language for yourself, like not having language from these ineffable experiences around transness, like what do? You have to kind of find it and assemble yourself through time. So that was like, in that way, I think it is a very like collaged aesthetic. I guess I also think that anybody who thinks that they aren't collaging themselves together is maybe giving themselves too much credit. I guess, or maybe that's just my own like bias or my own perception of the world, that like we live in a complex world of ready-mades, whether they're ready-made objects or commodities that we consume, or like, craft forms or languages that are handed down to us. Those are all kind of cultural ready-mades, and that's what we're doing. I think there's a case that can be made that it's like maybe queer people have more of an open awareness that that's what we're doing, because we have to set aside a lot of aspects of traditional culture that don't serve us. So we're choosing like what to actualize and what not to, what to snip out and what to glue down in that collage metaphor. And like, yeah, I mean, I think most everything I make is some form of like asset flip. I'm not really like modeling much of anything. And a lot of that comes to me from like a friend and another game developer, game designer, Porpentine, who talks about making things out of trash because all we have is trash. So, we have this like cultural inheritance of all of this stuff lying around. So do something with it, use the ready-mades that are around you, whether that's like the surplus available from game engines or like the 3D trash on the internet or images that mean something to you, to then put back into the game itself.
Yeah, I'm really keen, maybe in a bit, to talk about how you've kind of borrowed and kind of recontextualized avatars and sprites as well from games. But maybe first, I wanted to talk about another space that has figured in a couple of your projects, and that's the shopping mall. So I think the next slide might have grabs from Downstream: A Shining Wire, which I think is a reconstruction of an actual Utah shopping mall. And Recursion Plaza, which procedurally generates you a different shopping mall each time you play out of these parts that are sort of literally interchangeable, which is a really nice riff, I thought, on the fact that as someone who was a teen in the 90s, I think at the point shopping malls were seen as kind of exemplifying the vacuity of consumer culture, these sort of empty non-spaces where everything was this very kind of homogenous mainstream version of culture. And there was a lot of optimism around the coming of the internet, in part because it was going to release us from this and give us things that were sort of bespoke and personalized. But I feel like maybe there's something else going on in your games, and I also think there's other spaces where there's almost a kind of weird mournfulness or nostalgia for the shopping mall. I was reading Dana Boyd's 2014 book about how teenagers interact online. And she has this point that it's not necessarily that the internet's so much more exciting than hanging out at the mall. It's that malls became less accessible because parents became more paranoid about stranger danger, and malls started getting more heavy-handed about groups of teens convening there. So the internet almost de facto became the space where you could socialize. And she kind of implies that maybe in some ways the mall, even if it's this temple of consumerism, is sort of less dystopian than this very extractive environment of Facebook or Instagram. So I was kind of curious to know if that's something that's at work in kind of your work, that ambivalence. And also, I guess I think you've done VR chat performances in the model of the mall you created, which given that we're currently being told that we're on the verge of the metaverse and everyone's going to socialize in this new, even more fabulous, even more extractive online environment. Yeah, I wanted to invite you to think about that and to ask really what the malls are doing in your work and what they mean for you.
There's so many parts of that question. I feel like we could have a talk and a paper and a book, like
Yeah, I just
all of
babbled
that
about
stuff. I'm
malls
just
for
like,
20
oh, this. Yeah, damn. I guess I do really feel mournful about malls, and that's what tells me that I'm getting old. It's like, I think at the very least, yeah, I think you're totally right about the monoculture of the mall, and that in a way that's a bummer. And I think what we've done with moving our sites of consumption, our commons, is in the sense of like plazas and social spaces, and moving them online is indeed like ameliorate that monoculture by making a long tail of perfect silos of individualism, and where we're now in like a Tower of Babel moment, because we don't have common spaces, in part. I mean, I'm not like a huge cultural theorist. I don't know exactly why these things are happening, but I think that's part of it. And like, I think there's like a disquietingness. Like, I don't know the person you're talking about, Dana Boyd, I think you said is their name. I haven't read their book. I don't know. Like, I don't know about like factors around like stranger danger, parents, like malls becoming hostile. Like for me, in my experience, like, it's more economic. It was like malls closed because of big box retail and e-commerce. And so that's part of why people stopped going to them. And, the mall in question for me that's recreated in Downstream and Shining Wire was a mall called the Cottonwood Mall in Salt Lake City, Utah, where I grew up. It was like where my first dates were. It was like where my first job was. It was like where I would cut school to go to go hang out. And it was like in decline in the early 2000s, and then was demolished in 2007 with like the promise of like this big new outdoor style California style plaza mall. And of course, like the financial downturn of 2008 meant that it was like they demolished it and there was nothing there. It was a crater, million plus, I don't know, square foot crater in my neighborhood for more than 10 years back home. And so I guess that's what I would point to in the economic thing, where it was like that mall was bought by a at least national, if not international, developer of malls that really shut it down because other malls were more strategically viable. But in the context of the project, it was like, one, trying to resurrect that mall in this kind of like virtual mall necromancy, to be like, can I remake this space? Can I like, I talked to the county to try to get the blueprints for the mall, and they were initially really resistant because they were like afraid I was going to steal their mall that didn't even exist anymore. But a librarian helped me eventually get that stuff. And so I remade it with friends, like as best we could. We were all kind of teaching ourselves Blender as we were making it. So it's, if you go see it, it's in VR chat, and you can download it from my website. It's very shabby, as these images indicate. But yeah, I was trying to kind of recreate it, and putting it on VR chat, the idea was there that it could have that second life of a form of commons for people. And yeah, I mean, I think you're totally right to point out to like, yeah, malls were like commercially extractive and that you're there to buy things, but they're not, you know, trying to affect your behavior and surveilling you and atomizing your every action to power the platform of platform capitalism. And then I guess to speak to Recursion Plaza, I don't know, Recursion Plaza is like a procedurally generated dead shopping mall, you know, so everything is in decline. That's why everything is closing and 70% off. And so it's just like, it's almost a one-liner maybe to some extent, that it's like, it just infinitely generates death. It just infinitely generates its own ruin and its own decline, but in this like really beautiful, somber way. You know, the light moves across and it feels like, it's sort of meant to feel like an eternal Sunday afternoon. You know, they talk about that Sunday evening feeling. So I think that's part of what I was trying to conjure there.
For me, it was also
Yeah.
revelatory that you guys had Claire's Accessories in the US, because it's a fixture in UK shopping centers as well, and it's one of those weird details that's strangely poignant. So yeah, talking about that, because obviously there's a strong kind of personal dimension to your work, or it's rooted in your kind of memories and experiences. And one of my interests at the moment is biographical and autobiographical games. And I don't think those are terms you've ever used about your work. And in fact, as you say, it's actually quite skeptical in many ways about identity as something kind of stable and fixed and individual. At the same time, it's got this dimension of speaking to your own experience. And I think as you've sort of gestured towards, particularly in Ineffable Glossolalia, it's engaging with the life and the work of Magnus Hirschfeld, this Weimar sexologist who founded the Institute of Sexual Science in 1919, and is sometimes held up as this kind of hero and martyr in LGBTQ plus discourse because he was persecuted by the Nazis, but also has maybe a more complex legacy than that, as a lot of historians have argued and as you've argued. So to what extent do you see part of your work as autobiographical or biographical in nature when you're kind of tapping into these histories or these experiences?
Yeah, totally. You know, I think I come at it from a level that it's like, you can't ever get away from that stuff. Maybe it's more or less evident, or maybe it's like the voice is more or less clear what's autobiographical, but I don't know, at least me, I can never get away from myself. I'll think I'm doing a different piece of art and it turns out it's the same thing that I've done with like a slight difference, and you do these progressive orbits to try to get somewhere different, but with a lot of like Venn diagrams. So, you know, I mean, and I come at it too from like, my art practice is the way that I learn about myself and I learn about the world. So it's always got to focus on those two things in some form of reality or another. Yeah, and I think I had said earlier, Shrine Maidens is overtly about, in part about a relationship that I had, and Ineffable Glossolalia is, yeah, just me trying to like make sense of that experience. The experience of being trans, why there aren't words and language around these things, and then doing the historical research around like that this place existed where maybe language was being put to that, at least in a Western context, and it was burned by Nazi youth. And what does that feeling of absence feel like through time? Like, what are the steps and the stutters to try to get there? And yeah, in the process, I came across the Magnus Hirschfeld and the Institute for Sexual Research or Sexual Science, or Institute for Sexual Wissenschaft is the name of the thing. But and it's hard because that is something, as I did the research, that's really like lionized in a lot of queer trans spaces, and in a way they did a lot of like really progressive things. They had what they called transvestite pass cards, so that, you know, people who cross-dressed or people who were trans didn't get beat up and put in jail by the police. They were like, oh, you're a sanctioned mentally ill person, it's okay for you to do this. That's genuinely progressive, but at the same time, you know, a lot of the people that worked there were like you know, total scientific racists, total eugenicists, because like eugenics was just sort of the order of the day. And you know, Magnus Hirschfeld was a gay man who was also trying to cure gayness by like, you know, implanting pieces of like straight men's testicles in other, you know, gay men to like, you know, straighten them out and this kind of stuff. And you know, in some of those spaces in Ineffable Glossolalia, some of the text is taken from Magnus Hirschfeld and stuff about the Institute, and some is taken from, you know, the Nazis who, this specifically, like this, his name slips my mind right now, the Nazi librarian that like determined, like I think it's 13 points of like Volkish literature and like what that literature needs to be like. And they mash up really nicely in some ways, because like when you're obsessed with truth, scientific truth and purity and these kinds of things, it's funny what kind of overlaps happen and how easy it is to slip from one place to another. And some of the people involved with the Institute for Sexual Research, once it was destroyed by the Nazis, just became Nazis. So these aren't like easy dyads of like freedom fighters and Nazis all the time.
Yeah, no, I think it kind of gets into that complexity in an amazing way. And as you say, part of the fact that a lot of these histories and these ideas were kind of violently erased means a certain degree of nuance disappears. But it also means that maybe, as you say, people in the present have to be more resourceful in finding what kind of scraps are out there that they can work with. And I guess in this slide, I wanted to highlight how you've kind of picked up on avatars and playable characters from a range of games who you've kind of argued can be read as genderqueer, even if they're extremely problematic or extremely limited in terms of what they enable you to do or say. So I wanted to maybe come back around to those questions of role play and avatars and how you're kind of taking these bits of gamer culture and potentially quite trashy or problematic bits of them and trying to kind of refashion them or recontextualize them.
Yeah, it's there. It's like that. It like feeds exactly off of the stuff in Ineffable Glossolalia, that it's like you're saying, you know, when you don't have these clear things, you're reaching into mythology, or you're reaching into like, you know, head canon, the idea of like, okay, the canon that I put to this like media franchise in my head is like XYZ, and you know, you're picking at things like, you know, weird maybe slip ups in language, that Samus Aran from Metroid is maybe trans or something, because yeah, you have what you have at the end of the day. I mean, like, and what do I say? I mean, like, you know, growing up online and in Utah, I didn't know anybody who was trans until I was trans, and the spaces that there were to see stuff like that was porn. So it's like, oh, okay, you know, if I've learned who I am, you know, big air quotes, I'm speaking with big broad brushes here, from pornography, what does that leave you with? Well, then you'll take any kind of other like cultural inheritance that gives any semblance of possibility beyond that. And it's interesting to like put them in the context of avatars. I do think about role playing, and I don't think a ton about these in the context of avatars. I guess I just think of them in terms of like, it's not like necessarily being them, though you do like, there is that act in like playing video games. Like Juliana Huxtable wrote a really great short piece about like playing girls in video games, that, you know, the stuff from Characters Select Screen is like deeply indebted to that writing, that it's like, that's what you have, so you'll play it, you know, for any of these like scraps of feeling like you can be something that you want to be, or something that that I don't want to say represents, I hate talking about representation, but yeah, where you can like come into a union of knowing yourself deeply through the act of trying to know this like figment, or this like weird distilled down problematic fantasy version of it. And it's interesting, it's like most of my games are actually really vacant. Like, you know, they're not really like populated by people. And some of that is because that's about the isolation of transness, or growing up in a small kind of isolating place. Some of it is about like not wanting to put an avatar to a player character, both because a first person controller was like really easy for me to learn, and rigging a third person character controller model is much harder. But then it's like you put an avatar, like a playable avatar in that way on it, and it's like it's inherently not going to speak to somebody. And just like, you know, a lot of the installations that I did were also not populated. They're lonely spaces, they're ruinous spaces. So some of that like eschewing avatarness is also, yeah, just thinking about the ruin of the world. But I think that's changing a little bit, you know, in doing Downstream a Shining Wire, and like wanting to do that participatorily with other friends of mine to act stuff out. I think there's a turn towards that, a turn towards trying to do more social stuff, to speak to the social dimension of isolation more, the social dimension of ruin more.
Right. I mean, I really like the way by sort of taking some of this kind of quite bombastic gaming lore more seriously than it maybe merits. You're able to find things there. I'd never thought about the fact that Cammy from Street Fighter, who within the lore is kind of this vessel or proxy, is sort of a playable character within the diegesis, which is suddenly a really kind of rich idea. But also, yeah, it's very interesting to know that it's maybe partly a kind of pragmatic thing, that a lot of your work is kind of first person explorations of vacant environments. I guess that's less resource and skill intensive if you're kind of working with these kinds of DIY technologies, but that it's also something that you're kind of exploring alternatives to. I guess we're sort of running out of time because I want to leave some space for people to give comments and questions. But yeah, talking about platforms and talking again about some of those issues of kind of erasure and censorship over the last few years within gaming, whether you think about sort of Game Jolt delisting games that it's identified as having sexual content, or about Apple and Epic having this row about itch, where a lot of your games are hosted, and how it's this hotbed of offensive sexualized games. There does seem to be quite a sort of censorious attitude that these kind of platform holders and their walled gardens are bringing to the culture. I guess we could also look further to the way Tumblr was kind of purged of not safe for work content, or the back and forth over OnlyFans. And I was wondering how you kind of see your own kind of work or your own legacy in this environment where it seems quite parlous to be making games about sort of gender and sexuality at the moment. And it's something your games are about, but it's also something they face, I guess. I have an old laptop that games that won't run on the 64-bit compatible Mac OSs I have to play on. So yeah, how does that concern with kind of ephemerality speak to the way that you try and document your work, or how you think about its kind of legacy?
That's such a great question. It's like a really living question. I've only kind of recently become aware of the issue with Macs, and it's such a bummer. Macs were always really hard to develop for anyway, because they want you to go through their platforms and that kind of thing. And now they're just killing off a bunch of my catalog that, because I guess, I had a hard drive mishap and I can't re-export some of that stuff. So it'll just kind of exist as it exists. It's hard. I don't know. I can't say that I've followed people censoring itch or censoring other platforms. I just think itch is such a, I don't know. I mean, I guess I don't follow it partly because I don't see these things as games. And to me, I guess whenever anything mainstreams, it's gonna just get watered down and it's going to get bad. And what I love about itch is it's just such a weird, bizarre marketplace to find stuff like that you can, like that just needs to exist. And I'm so grateful for those people for putting that together, because like I could never get anything of mine on Steam. There's no way. I could host it on my website for all of the traffic I'm sure that doesn't generate. So just to know there's a repository for people to browse that weirdness is super important. I haven't, I guess with the exception of like one exhibition, I haven't really dealt with a lot of like censorship of the games. Most people know what they're getting into, but yeah, there just has to be spaces for weird stuff to accumulate. And I guess that's another concern back to platform capitalism, that all of these things being, needing to be squeaky clean or needing to appear, viable to the largest mass culture possible, just makes it hard for that stuff to happen on a content level, like you're saying, and then also an access level in terms of them needing to be of a certain quality.
And it seems like your current work, to maybe kind of wrap this up and talk about what you're kind of working on now and working on next, is in part about that, looking back to sort of peer-to-peer file sharing and older ways of kind of sharing and archiving media, maybe outside of strictly legal or strictly kind of conventional ways of doing that. So is that something tell me more about that essentially?
Yeah, totally. You're super on it. So one of the things I do, this space that I'm coming to you now from is like a collective, new media hackery space that I run with some other folks, an artist named Mira Lilith Day and an artist named D Solid State. And we have this collective named Bitmolds. And so the piece that Rob is talking a little bit about there is, was at the Jacksonville Museum of Contemporary Art in Florida in US. And it's essentially like a media server where we've just uploaded all of the media that made us like really formative things, because we're, I guess, I almost hate to say nostalgic, but that it felt like a freer time of the internet. It felt like a way that people could connect more again without those like dynamos of social media platform trying to turn that extractive or, flood it with negative affect for their own purposes. So that's you can probably access it from their website, but it's the piece is called gladesindarkforests.cloud. And maybe in a sec I could like type it in the chat or something, but you can go and download a bunch of stuff there. And then, exploring the subversiveness of technology in that way, because, and we never talked to them about it. The show's about to come down, but we are mining cryptocurrency on that computer in their gallery to then think about like, what is the space of like pirating the, actual financial means from an institution to then distribute to other people who might need it as part of that piece. And then other stuff I'm working with another couple of people, DB Amarin and Ralph Pugai, on a series of talks at a website called frictionless.fail, where just as kind of novice artists, we're trying to process emergent technologies and what is happening. A lot of it is focusing on like NFTs and blockchain technology, as that is like, what a lot of artists are talking about right now, and an extremely fraught technology, a whole other conversation about like the role of that and metaverse and things like Axie Infinity and like play to earn as this model for disrupting economies and people's lives. And I'm working on a new game that's maybe like a spiritual sequel to Ineffable Glossolalia that's about radicalisation and neo-reactionary movements and how those are vectored by like too much information versus the not enough information that Ineffable Glossolalia is sort of about. So writing scripts and stuff like that. Like it'll be a much more wordy, much more populated game. So we'll see how that turns out.
That's super interesting and kind of opens up a million other things we could talk about, which is maybe good because we should probably turn to the chat and see whether people had questions that they wanted to pose. I think one came in from Fong. Someone has also flagged, Heike Bauer's amazing book about the Hirschfeld archives, which certainly delves into a lot of those complexities you were talking about.
Oh, cool. Great. Thank you for that recommendation.
Yeah, it sounds like Fong was curious to hear about the relationship between magic rituals and games, a bit more about that. So I'll read you the question. Would be good to hear if you have a general outlook on the relationship between magic rituals and games, or whether you explore where it takes you in each work as you create it.
I guess I feel like I explore in each work as I create it. I think, obviously people like Johann Huizinga write about like the magic circle of play and like entering these alternative rule spaces to get at this other stuff. There's like, I think some of it has to do with identity formation. Some of it has to do with like forms of divination, where it's like you can do magic to try to like take space out of space to see into another world or another moment. And some of that is in my work, Utopia Without You, the one with the crystal ball. There's like a lot of divination themes in that, like a needing to like learn to see in geological time outside of hardship in a moment. There's connections, I think, through genres of speculative fiction in that way, where like speculative fiction isn't predictive, but it sees through time in enhancing the terms or contradictions of a moment. And that's a big part of games, if not an inherent part of games, but a lot of games are speculative genres in that way. Otherwise, each game or, element of a magic practice is different for me. So the one about it was called Petition to Malphus, the one with the sigil, the demon sigil, and the little PlayStation was like, trying to learn to work with bureaucracy. Malphus is like a tower builder. So, trying to get guidance from him about how these institutions are built and how one can move through them. The piece where I'm eating frosting is a ritual to try to transition. Honestly, it was this like pre-transition work, and to engage that magic by doing a weird transcendent thing that does something to your body, in this almost like ecstatic state of eating too much frosting. I don't know if I answered that question, but I kind of scattershotted some.
No, I think that's a really rich answer. And
Yeah.
certainly Utopia Without You, having experienced on my laptop trackpad sort of what it is to manipulate that asteroid, I feel like you lose a dimension that has to do with those objects and that situation, and how you've kind of curated the space as well. But yeah, if other people have questions, I'd be really curious to hear how Tabitha's work might intersect with your research interests, or anything you wanted to.
Can I jump in with a question?
Of course.
Rob, is that okay? Thank you so much, Tabitha, for that talk, and for Rob for kind of curating some of the work there for us and asking such insightful questions. My question is about the intimacy that's engendered by games. It's something I'm researching at the moment and thinking a lot more about. And I'm trying to think about the ways in which intimacy might be engendered by games in more than a one-on-one. We tend to think about games as kind of an intimate act because it's like one person playing and they're engaging with their avatar through the screen in this kind of in this sort of like very isolated or individual kind of way. But I'm wondering about it, the way you're using games and the way you're using performance and art. Is there a way in which games might engender intimacy with bigger audiences, with more people in a kind of more of a networked, collaborative kind of way? That's kind of what I'm interested in, and I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, damn, I love thinking about that. Thank you. I think it's like I tend to be in that scale of like micro, meso, macro work. I tend to be somewhere on the micro to maybe meso scale of like social interaction, like how far you want to cast that net socially. So I think like, a lot of the work that I've done coming from like downstream A Shining Wire onward is like really, I just think it's so important to get people together in a space and do physical things around the digital. So it's like, for me and the people that I tend to work with as collaborators, it's like, for a lot of us, these digital spaces have so much potential for personal transformation because you can be different people online, in anonymized contexts, but to then like reinforce that with a physical sense of belonging in some sort of collective experience. Like, when we filmed the videos that go with Downstream A Shining Wire in the mall, we were all in a room together, actually in a VR lab at a community college here, and, got to have pizza and stuff with each other after, and like trying to run this space. Like, I think I don't know that it scales to the level of like broader audiences, but I'm very skeptical of the claims that get made about like VR as like empathy machine. We hear all the time, and I don't know, I've had very few VR experiences where I felt like that. And a lot of times it just seems like a ploy of capital to get at people, to get people to invest in this space. So I think games in a larger sense can. I think, I've never been a big LARPer, but I think, that kind of scale of things, bonding people together, because, doing D&D and that kind of stuff was super, super intimate and super bonding and super connective in those ways. So I think absolutely can, but through a networked situation, I don't have any good answers for. Thanks
for that. No, that's great.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think you're right about VR. There's lots of claims made in the study of eco games about, like you say, VR as empathy machines, but like some of the most impressive VR eco installations are some of the most exclusive and the most expensive and the most like also, you know, guzzling huge amounts of carbon in order to be even put on in the first place. There's massive problems there, but yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and to say a bit more about that, this is the work where you're having kind of performances and readings inside virtual spaces, right? And that's really interesting to know that the performers are kind of physically proximate in those cases.
Yeah, which is weird. It's like not taking advantage of the medium in a way, certainly, but also I think helped the people who were doing it. Yeah, and like, you know, to some of what Chloe is talking about, that I just am always leery of like the relationship between spectacle and intimacy. It's like you want the spectacle of the VR, but you're also expecting it to do intimacy. And I think spectacle inherently takes us away from that, but maybe I'm wrong. Yeah.
Well, as more of a digital games person, it is really interesting to hear more about the extent to which sort of tabletop and that kind of RPG play is part of your work. I think we've got a raised hand from Jack as well. I will unmute him.
Hello,
Jack.
hi. I just had I loved this talk so much, and I write about queerness and role play, so there's so much to think about in relation to that. But I had a question specifically about winning and losing, and particular like that. It seems to be a general sort of theme in queer games. I'm thinking of like Matthew Bryce's Minichi or all of Robert Young's games. You can't win or lose them, and there's like no capacity to gain capital or anything like that. And I was wondering what would your games are the same, and I was wondering what was your thoughts, I guess, on winning and losing in relation to queerness and games. And I think Rob, you've written about like walking sims as well, so I don't know if you've got something to say about that too.
Yeah, totally. I don't know, I guess if I think about whether anyone in games that I make is winning or losing, it seems like mostly losing or just kind of ending in an odd dispersed sense of like uncertainty about what one might make of it. And I think that's queer, right? Like having I mean, that's inherently queer, right? That is what it means to like have no fixed or clear understanding of the results of something, you know, not in a way to like, it's not queer in the sense of like trying to be inspirational towards like queer identity or yeah, that there's some kind of, again, that's back to like no satisfying, I just don't have very satisfying mechanics in the game at all. But yeah, I'm into that. And I'm into anything that like takes the terms of the medium into like a deeper sense of potential. Like I think so much with games, there's this like, maybe just with game engines, I should say, like Unity and Unreal seem like constantly in pursuit of you know, AAA game fidelity, like really trying to like maximize that stuff, which is mostly about seeming like cinema. And I feel like in that there's so much like abandoned potential that's just like the surplus of capital that's left on the table as they're like running off in accelerationism trying to do a thing. And so I'm into anything that like gathers that up and reconfigures that in an end that doesn't resemble that other thing, which seems partly about your question, Jack, in terms of like win states and loss states. But yeah, I also want to hear from Rob about walking simulators.
Well, I think one of the reasons that something like Shrine Maidens or Ineffable Glossolalia is so interesting is because walking simulators, for all that they might not have traditional win states, often do kind of nudge you towards this moment of revelation where everyone learns and grows, and that it gives, maybe it's more of a narrative payoff than a ludic payoff. But I think the way that you ask us to think about a lot of different contexts, to absorb a lot of information, to draw connections, that work doesn't necessarily stop with a neat eureka moment. And I think that's a really valuable thing about them. I've also just caught sight of myself on screen and realized that I look like I'm now speaking to you from the bottom of a well because I haven't turned my lamp on. But yeah, any other questions? That was really interesting question from Jack. And yeah, I know some other people here maybe are coming more. There's
one in the chat as well, which I can read out if you like. I was really struck by the image of the computer screen in the pile of dirt in your early piece with the soy plants, thinking about it in relation to recursive plaza. Was wondering about the dynamics of growth versus procedural generation, and more broadly, the movement between organic and inorganic material in your work. What a brilliant question. Thank you.
I'm so grateful to all of you for Jack and Rob and Chloe, and I can't tell BODL 3236. All such amazing questions. You're giving me so much to chew on and thinking about that. Oh, that is also Jack. Multi-Jacks. Yeah. Damages, growth. Yeah, I mean, it's like ruin is kind of in everything. It's like there is the dirt and there is the plants in that. There's also the ruined skyscraper there, and the ruined skyscrapers floating around. And so there is, you know, maybe that's like almost a futurist cliche, not in the sense of like Italian futurism, but in the sense of like that like optimist futurism, in the sense of like, oh, okay, these things like grow up around the wreckage of the old. I think maybe that's definitely there, trying to like do what you can with what you have, which is back to collage aesthetics and that kind of thing. You know, just doing procedurally generated stuff has been like, it's really fascinating because it's just a different way of working that's not like set dressing. It's much more rhythmic. It's much more an alive way of working, a much more emergent way of working. Like between that and Liquid Dungeon Byproduct are the two procedural things that I have. Yeah, there's just like, if any of you are thinking about doing that or do that, I don't know, there's just such a beautiful potential for life. But in terms of like the organic versus inorganic, that's a thing that I do, or I try to do in a lot of the work that I do, is these contrasts. Like in Utopia Without You Too, there's like an almost like abject quality between like the aquarium full of liquid that's like bubbling away, and it seems like it's something that would host life, but that it has this like technical thing shoved in it, because that's my experience of the virtual, is like, oh, it's actually really abject. It actually bleeds back and forth, and like a sense of self and a sense of birthing and a sense of blood and guts comes out of that thing, you know, and that can be a good thing or that can be a dark thing, but those two things are inseparable, and so they should be exhibited that way together. That truth should be encompassed among one another. Yeah.
That's a really great response. And there's a strange kind of overdetermination to the soy plant at this stage in human culture, between sort of alt-right harangues of soy boys and questions of kind of sustainability and what a future environment will look like ecologically. It kind of condenses those in a way that I think is really witty. And I suppose we haven't necessarily talked about your writing, but I feel like even the gamiest of your games, or even your artist statements that accompany them, there's just such kind of interesting use of language and puns and condensations of different words that feels like it also speaks to that collage in some ways. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I don't know how central you see that as being to your practice or not.
Yeah, the writing, I mean, it's like it's nice because I guess it's different than trying to make games, which is such a, at times, just like molasses process for somebody who's not trained in them. You're just like moving slowly through trying to make something that feels a bit like it. Whereas I love language, and it's just as a medium, it comes easier for me. So to be able to have this kind of like glacially formed space that's immersive, and then to have text that's like internally immersive, does that kind of inception nesting doll thing that I try to do in a bunch of different stuff. Yeah, and just like that slippage, the slippages that happen in language add to that dreamy quality as well, of just like uncertain signifiers, which I think, you know, feel queer for those who are here that are interested in that like one thing is one thing, seems to be another thing, doing double duty at all times. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, it's been amazing to talk to you and to hear both about some of your really early work and where things are going next. And it's great that so many of you were able to join us. But I guess maybe we should kind of leave it there. Thanks so much for getting up early and coming to the space and being here, Tabitha. Really looking forward to seeing where your work goes next.
I really appreciate you all. Thank you for having me. Thanks for your time.